Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Obviously, we are not in the normal studio today. Actually, we are in Huntington Beach at Real World Shooting. It's a pretty nice gun shop down here. I urge you to look it up if you haven't been here and are in the area. We're here with shop owner and our Southern California Coastal Chapter Chair, Mike Garner. Mike, thank you for being here with us today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I've been talking with Mike, and with the plethora of experiences that you have, and with the ongoing grassroots efforts for the Second Amendment community, you've put together a PowerPoint that you're trying to get out as much as possible on Second Amendment conversations. So what exactly is your goal behind this message?
Well, Kevin, so many of the times the conversation that you have with somebody that's anti-gun or is pro-gun control is such an emotional conversation. It's one that people don't want to hear some of the time. And I find that as conservatives, we are more prone to keep our opinions to ourselves, where the other side isn't. Now, my goal isn't to convince somebody that's rabidly anti-gun to change their mind.
Right.
However, maybe the people that are watching the discussion will hear us making points based in logic, based with facts, not on emotion, and maybe we win them over to our side. And further, we can spread these conversations that people will have. They can go and have the same conversation with other people. So I'd like to see it done without emotion on our side, basis of logic and facts, easy to spread.
So pun intended. I mean, really what it is you're trying to provide ammunition for people who might not otherwise find it in their daily intake of media or news or whatever you want to call it, that might be a bystander in a conversation that you're having with somebody. So I'd say let's just jump right into this and see what's going on.
All right, Second Amendment conversations. How to effectively protect the Second Amendment in the face of growing gun control pressure. We see it in the news. We hear people talk about it. If something occurs, a shooting, it gets the most coverage possible on TV, and that's just the way it is. And so much of the time, it's hard to have a conversation about that and present your side without the emotion that, hey, something bad has just happened. So what we're going to start with is what are just basic effective debate techniques. For example, you want to use facts that prove your position or disprove your opponents. You want to know the facts that you're going to use in advance. Now, nobody can memorize all the different facts regarding gun control, violent crime statistics. So what I like to do is I like to pick 2 or 3 that for the most part are ones that you're going to hear come up in a discussion. You want to be able to back up your facts with sources that will withstand scrutiny. I read it on a blog that doesn't withstand scrutiny. I got it from the 2018 FBI federal crime statistics. That's a fact.
Right.
Facts are the enemy of the emotional arguments that are most often used against gun control. So, powerful tool against the emotion is the facts.
And I guess, while you're keeping in mind, arguing with somebody who's giving you emotionally based arguments, you just got to understand and keep the mentality. You're not necessarily, what you're saying is you're not necessarily trying to win that person over. You're trying to win over everybody else who might be around you in that conversation, who might not have that sort of emotion within their arguments. I think just thinking about that would definitely be a good idea to keep in the back of your head. It's tough sometimes when somebody is emotional and you're trying to have a discussion with them. It's not necessarily them that you're trying to win over.
And the way you win the ones in the crowd over is you don't become agitated. Don't become emotional yourself. Remember the 20 decibel rule. If your voice goes up 20 decibels in one conversation, of the ability of other people around you to listen to what you have to say and absorb it goes down dramatically.
Right.
So you want to stay, keep an even tone pace. When you can counter your opponent's arguments politely and early, you're going to set them off track. You're going to get them flustered. What's the first thing that happens when somebody is flustered? They start making mistakes. They start flubbing things. If your opponent throws out a bogus fact, pounce on it immediately. And that's where being knowledgeable allows you to contradict it. But be sure you can back up how you're contradicting it with something reasonable. You want to use specific facts. Use specific examples to refute the opponent's positions. Some of the don'ts that you don't want to do. You don't want to get personal, and you don't want to generalize. Don't say Democrats are anti-gun, because I know lots of Democrats that aren't anti-gun at all. Now, if you were to say people on the progressive left tend to be anti-gun, you're not specifically going after a political party, you're going after a movement which does have a history. Right. You want to be polite. If you are polite and the other person's rude, you will come off as the smarter of the two. Now, I'm not the smarter of the two people in most discussions. Let's be honest with that. But if I'm polite, at least I come off better.
So that perception can kind of become reality because you're not getting flustered, you're being nice, and you're just not letting this overall, and I guess I'll use the word emotional sense, again, kind of take you over.
Correct. You don't want to water down strong arguments with weak ones, and one of the easiest ways is to switch into an emotional argument. You want to plan just a few talking points and stick with them. Because remember, the crowd of people that you are trying to convince, they may not be around for all that long. We have short attention spans. If we want to get a point across, we want to get the point across relatively quickly, give them 2 or 3 bits of information, tease them along. They can do research themselves and start to form an unbiased opinion. Okay, for example, and one of these, I've had this thrown into my face in the past. Do you know 33,000 Americans are killed by gun violence every year? To which my response is, absolutely. Roughly 33,000 Americans die by guns each year. Did you know that 23,000 of those approximately are Americans who took their own life? So is that a gun problem? Or is that a mental health problem? Now, firearms just were the tool, just like sleeping pills, just like jumping off of a building could have been. Further, out of the 10,000 plus homicides that are remaining, according to the last statistics of the FBI in 2018, 992 were justifiable homicides.
So can you describe to me what a justifiable homicide is?
If somebody uses a firearm in a robbery, robs a bank, comes out, sees the police, starts shooting,
Got it.
Police shoot them, kill them. Also, if somebody comes into your home with a gun or with something and attacks you in self-defense, it's ruled a justifiable homicide. These numbers go into what they like to say gun violence stats. Well, the 23,000 deaths by suicide, that's not a violent gun crime. That's a mental health issue. And if you were to look further into it, and I don't have specific numbers on this, the number of so-called assault weapons that are used in homicides, dramatically lower. And more, we see those being justifiable law enforcement homicides, where there's been a prolonged shootout already, police officer shows up and has to use a long gun.
So, I mean, this is almost an evergreen thing. These statistics are going to go up a little bit or down a little bit from year to year. But over, what would you say, the last decade, the kind of average has always been there, and it hasn't really changed that much. It's always been a large proportion that have been suicides. The justifiable homicides, that hasn't really changed from year to year either, has it?
No, they stay very, very close to standard. The last statistics I quoted from the FBI were 2018. The data has been skewed somewhat since COVID.
Right.
But
But the point that I'm getting at is, this is something that you can commit to memory to be in your arsenal of arguments that isn't really going to change from day to day.
correct.
And that is a common one. I hear it a lot. And, generally speaking, it comes in the form of, how many lives is enough? How many people are going to have to, suffer on behalf of firearms? But then the argument ends up remaining. They're not really suffering because of firearms. They're suffering because of other issues in our society.
Correct.
Right.
Another common anti-gun myth that's easy to debunk. The Founding Fathers didn't mean the Second Amendment to include AR-15s with 100-round drums. Well, the truth to that is yes, they specifically did mean that. The intent of the Second Amendment at the time it was written was so that the American people would have armaments comparable to the government, because they had just been through the Revolution, and the first thing the British tried to do were take guns. Lexington and Concord came from the British coming to take firearms. Thomas Jefferson said the strongest reason for people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in the government. That's Thomas Jefferson. The best we can hope for concerning people at large is that they be properly armed. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Paper number 28. Firearms stand next to the Constitution itself. They're the American people's liberty, teeth, and keystone of independence. George Washington. So those are three of the Founding Fathers reinforcing what I just said at the time that it was written. And if you dig deeper into it, you'll find there were many other of the Founding Fathers that it's very clear what their intent was if you're willing to look at it. So the bottom line is the Founding Fathers did intend us not to just be able to defend our homes, but to defend ourselves against the tyranny of government.
So, as you're going over some of these quotes, what's really popping up in my mind is really the perversion of, a lot of what was written and what was said at the time. If you break down the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, necessary to a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms seems like a pretty simplistic statement in that of itself. It's separated by a comma. There are two statements in that, and I think that they're both true, yet we find people, scholars, and I'll put the air quotes up, who spend a lot of time trying to trick their brain into thinking the Founding Fathers meant something other than they wrote. What is an effective tool against a perversion of this language?
Well, if we look back at some of the original drafts, one of the original draft of the Second Amendment included the phrase, and I quote, "for the common defense." This version was rejected because it didn't protect an individual's right to keep and bear arms. So the Founding Fathers rejected attempts to water it down even then. And as we've seen in the Bruin decision in New York, the Supreme Court has now kicked it back into at the time it was written. That, I think, highlights some of the strength of the arguments and some of the writings of the Founding Fathers at the time as to what they did intend.
Right.
Okay, another one that we hear quite a bit, we need more gun control to stop active or mass shootings. Well, the truth is, the states with the highest number of guns per capita are the ones with the lowest number of gun violence and also accidental deaths. Specifically, any some of the states that have got the very highest, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, if you look at their gun violence statistic, it's almost nothing. So that doesn't actually hold up. Now, there's a difference between a mass shooter and an active shooter. For example, if you read on Breitbart over the weekend, often there's a column of how many shootings there were that occurred in Chicago. If there are 5 people that are sitting on a porch and dealing drugs and somebody walks up and opens fire, is that a mass shooting?
I think that you would get a lot of people who define the word mass shooting the same as a mass murder, which would be, 3 or more deaths.
3 or more at the same time,
Right,
to be past the spree. But you could, even though the one person was shooting at the drug dealer, the rest of those people may be considered victims of the same thing. So really, the image of somebody going into a school and opening fire, going into a shopping mall and opening fire, the definition of mass shooting has been expanded to paint a narrative that it is a much more common thing that occurs. And a lot of the information on that shows the media has something directly to do with that. And I'm talking about the American Psychological Association. They did a paper a number of years ago, and it found that the number one contributing factor was the media.
Oh, sure.
Now, the correlation between gun-free zones and active shooters, you'd think that those should be safe areas. No, many of the true active shooter events that we've seen lately, or over years, all the way back, the Florida nightclub shooting, where so many people were shot in that, if it hadn't been a gun-free zone, statistically, 5% of the people in there should have been CCW holders.
Right.
Another, during the period of 2000 through 2017, FBI statistics that show that 13.1% of every active shooting event was stopped by an armed citizen other than active duty law enforcement.
Well, and that's something you're not really going to get in the media, right? Because that would show, kind of a positive portrayal of firearms, and it seems like they are so hell-bent on creating a negative picture of firearms. So, I mean, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is, when it comes to this thing where you have somebody who says we need more gun control, I mean, you have plenty of statistics that you can look at. You have plenty of history that you can look at when you're just talking about gun-free zones. And honestly, something that I hold at a very high value is making sure that the terms within your debate or argument are defined. When you have somebody, and we have 2 very different looking statistics out there right now, just for 2022. There are some statistics that are showing that there are, I think it's in like the 200s now, 200 mass shootings. And then you have other statistics that are showing that there's been 1. And I think that is a huge disparity in the definition of what a mass shooting is, right? Because in the one column, you can have mass shootings that have 0 deaths and just 2 people harmed. Some of them are 0 people harmed, just, an active shooter in a public area. And then you have the other defining it as a situation where 3 or more people were murdered in one event, defining it as a mass murder. So I think really what you're saying here is that defining terms is super important for everybody around you when you're discussing these things, especially at a time where we have 2 very different definitions of a lot of words.
Absolutely. Getting 2 sides to define or go with the same definition is going to be hard. You can use statistics to lie about anything. Right. I'd like to touch the governor of New York recently said at a press conference that the concept of a good guy with the gun has been disproven beyond anything. I'd like to ask the 13% of active shooters that the FBI say were stopped. I'd like to ask the people that were in those venues when the shooting happened. Do they feel that that argument has been disproven?
Yeah, and I don't really see a whole lot of room for that argument. Also, when you have the statistics coming out of the CDC that average anywhere between 750,000 to 2 million defensive handgun uses every year in the United States. I mean, that far outweighs the earlier statistic of 33,000 deaths. So if you're talking about the potential of saved lives while using a tool versus lives that weren't saved, there's a huge disparity there as well.
Absolutely there is.
So, really looking at a couple of these arguments, and I mean, these are pretty basic arguments that don't have to have a whole lot of, statistics or anything behind them. You're saying it's important that we have statistics, that we have knowledge. I mean, what's the threshold? What threshold do you have to? What's the threshold of confidence that you have to engage in this kind of conversation where you can actually have a positive impact for the firearms community as opposed to a negative one?
I think if you've done a little bit of your homework, if you've made yourself knowledgeable, don't make decisions based off the mainstream media, what you hear. Don't just look at a blog. There are a number of different legitimate sites that you can get crime information on. At minimum, the FBI statistics that are put out on a regular basis, that's the National Crime Reporting System. So you're on a good footing there. If you look at history, all you've got to do is go through the Federalist Papers, any number of different books or articles that have been put out of the Founding Fathers' belief in the protecting ourselves with the Second Amendment. And frankly, they made that the Second Amendment after only the free speech, religion. So clearly it was intended to be very important at the time it was written. It remains the same now, though it's been chipped away at for a couple of centuries.
So, I mean, and then we find ourselves here in 2022, right? You're the chair of the SoCal Coastal chapter. You've gone through this PowerPoint with your chapter, so obviously you think it's important that the people who are attending these chapter meetings and participating in this grassroots movement understand these things because they have their own networks. They go out and talk to people. They might find themselves in these situations. What is your message to the rest of California, even other CRPA chapters? What is your message to them on the importance of this?
If we don't stand up for our rights, and the first way we do that is by talking to people, explaining them. A lot of them have heard a very colored negative opinion on firearms from one side. Show them the truth. We have people that come in all the time that say, "Oh, I don't like guns." Well, what do you mean you don't like guns? It's an inanimate object. Well, have you ever gone shooting? No. Well, how about we set you up with one of our instructors, go out and go shooting? They come back, they've had a great time. They found out that, like any tool, if it's used properly, it can be used safely. Shooting sports provide a lot of fun. There's the protection aspect. It's an enjoyable hobby when used responsibly, and nobody more than the gun industry is better about self-regulating than that.
Right. Well, hey, Mike, I appreciate you putting this together. I appreciate you sharing it with us. Definitely lots of good things to come. We're looking forward to these 2022 elections. Just a reminder, you guys, if you can, be sure to like, share, and subscribe these videos. This is a grassroots movement. We are looking to get this message out to as many people as we can. When you hit those buttons, it really helps with the YouTube algorithms to get it out as far as we can. Make sure and stay tuned for more videos to come.